Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Kuf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Rabbi Joshua Waxman in loving memory of his father, Nachum Gedalia ben Yirmiyahu v'Fega Mina, on his 5th Yortzeit. May his neshama have an aliyah. Okay, we're going to get started with a statement that we saw yesterday in yesterday's daf of Gufa. We're going to go back. This is at the bottom of Kufa Mudbet. Ha'ochel gidan hasheshel behemat me'ah Rabbi Yehuda mechayev shtayim. So Rabbi Yehuda says you're liable twice. Right, 2 sets of lashes if you eat the gid and asheh of a non-kosher animal. Rabbi Shimon potil, and this is the part we didn't really talk about, which is why does Rabbi Shimon exempt? Remember, Rabbi Yehuda holds if it's an isur kolel, ein isur halal isur, you can't have one prohibition on another prohibition. If it was already non-kosher, then you can't also forbid the gid and asheh. But we said that since the gid and asheh, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is more severe because it applied even before they got the Torah, that already overrides the issue of you can't have another prohibition, go on another one, right? If it's more stringent, then it works. But why does Rabbi Shimon exempt? Now, he exempts you completely, even though you're eating the gid and a non-kosher animal. So the Gemara asks, Rabbi Shimon, miman nafshach, either which way you look at it, it seems like it should be prohibited somehow, because isur halal isur, if you say there's one prohibition that can fall on another prohibition, can apply, then you should be liable because it's not kosher, and you should be liable because of the gid. If you say you can't have one prohibition go on top of another prohibition, you should at least be obligated because you ate non-kosher meat. You ate the gid of a non-kosher animal. That's forbidden. Well, that's only if you hold that gidim have taste and therefore they're part of the prohibition to eat them. But even if you say they don't have any taste, and then you wouldn't be liable because it's non-kosher animal, but then lichayv mishum gid, well then it's not a problem of ein isur chal isul. The only prohibition should be the gid and asheh. So either which way, we don't really understand why Rabbi Shimon didn't obligate. To which they answer, Amarava, Lo'olam kasaval ein begidim benotein ta'am. Really, he holds there's no taste in them, and you're not obligated for eating gid of a non-kosher animal. Okay, but now for what reason? So first of all, when it was not, right, when it's just the gid, okay, so now we're going to see. If it's the non-kosher animal, so it wasn't part of the original prohibition, but you should be obligated because of the gid, even if it doesn't have taste. The Torah said don't eat it, that's a prohibition. So he says, V'shanei hatam da'amar kra al ken lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael et gid hanasheh. The Jewish people can't eat the gid hanasheh. So what do they learn from this? Misha gido asul u'b'saro mutar. It's only if the gid is forbidden and the meat is permitted. In other words, you can't eat, when you're eating meat, don't eat the sciatic nerve. But if the gid is forbidden and the meat is forbidden, well, that's not part of this. We're talking about only when you can eat the meat, don't eat the gid. If you can't eat the meat, well, then there's no prohibition for the gid. So basically, we're going to say the gid doesn't have taste, the sciatic nerve. So you weren't obligated if you ate it when it was just, if you just look at it from the non-kosher element. And there's no isur of gid because the gid and asheh is only a prohibition for a kosher animal. And then we've resolved it. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Now we're moving on to a similar case, which is ha'ochel gid and asheh shel nevela, another non-kosher meat, but this is meat that was kosher but was not slaughtered. So if you eat the gid and asheh and nevela, now let's think about it. The isur of gid comes first, because first you can't eat the gid of any animal. Then, when the animal is kosher at first, so you're only prohibited to eat the gid. Then it becomes a nevela, then you're forbidden because it's a nevela. So you're going to be obligated twice, gid and nevela. So, let's see. We're going to have a machloket. Rabbi Meir mechayev shtayim. Rabbi Meir says you're liable for both. And that's because we're going to call this an isur kolel. What does that mean? Well, originally, before it became a nevela, just the gid of that meat was forbidden, of that animal. Now that it became an avela, everything of the animal is forbidden. So that's what we call a prohibition, has room to apply because now it's applying for all the meat, so that can include the gid. And that's Rabbi Meir's position. Chachamim omrim eino chayav ela echad. But the rabbis say you're only chayav one. Okay, you're chayav for the gid because that came first. So now, basically, we're going to say the Chachamim don't hold by isur kolel, right? However, modim chachamim l'Rabbi Meir ba'ochel gid hanasheh shel ola v'shel shor niskal. If you have a korban ola, which is forbidden to eat, and it's also forbidden to benefit from, likewise a shor niskal. That's it, right? Remember, the korban ola has to be burnt completely. A shor niskal is an ox that gored and killed a person, and is supposed to be killed. And it was ruled in a court that this ox is to be put to death. If you were to eat the gid on a sheh of either a korban ola or a shor and iskal, shechayev shtayim. Why you chayev shtayim? Because in addition to the fact that once it became a korban ola and a shor and iskal, first it was only gid and a sheh, the sciatic nerve, then it became, the whole animal became, so that's an isur kolel, and in addition, it went up in level of severity because now it's forbidden to benefit from. So in that case, the rabbis would agree when it's isur kolel and more stringent, we're going to say you're obligated. To which the Gemara says, okay, uman hai tana de isur kolel, isur chalal, isur leitle, isur kolel, isur chamor itle. Who's the one who says that just isur kolel, there's no, right, we're not going to say it works, but if it's isur kolel in a more severe area, it is going to work. So who says that? And now we're going to try to figure this out. So in other words, we're saying which Tana is the opinion of the rabbis? Who do they go by? So I'm a Rava. Rabbi Yossi Aglilihi. Rava says this is Rabbi Yossi Aglili's position. Ditnan, as we see here. Now what's interesting about this, we're looking for someone who holds isur kolel I don't hold by, but I do hold by it when it's an isur chamor. Now we're not going to really see that I do hold by it when it's an isur chamor, but we are going to see he doesn't hold by isur kolel, and then we're going to assume that because he doesn't hold by isur kolel in a regular case, we can assume he holds that way in a more severe case, when it's a stringent matter, when it goes up in stringency as well. Okay? So you're not going to find two cases where one he says no and one he says yes. Okay? Ditnan says in the Mishnah, Tamesha achal kodesh. Now you have to get some facts on the ground, which is if you're a regular person and you eat meat that became a sacrificial meat that became tameh, impure, it's forbidden. Okay, you can't eat kachim that became impure. If you become impure, you also can't eat kachim. Okay, like let's say pure kachim, you're not allowed to eat that. So the question is going to be, what if we have a crossover? An impure person, who, by the way, if the impure person eats, we're going to see it's more severe because it's karet. You get karet if you're impure and you eat sacrificial items. If you're a person who just eats sacrificial items that became impure, you don't get karet for that. Okay, but we'll come back to that soon. So comes Rabbi Yossi Aglili and he says, Tamesh achalat tahor chayav. Tamesh achalat tamei patul. If you're an impure person who ate pure sacrificial items, you're going to be liable karet. But if you ate sanctified items that were already disqualified, they're tamei, you're exempt. Shelo chal ela davar tamei, because you didn't. What's the problem? When you're impure, you can't eat these high-level sanctity items that are in good shape. But if you eat them once they became impure, it doesn't matter. You're just not obligated karet. Amrulo, the rabbi said to him, the rabbis have a great claim to him. They say, wait a minute. We're assuming when you go eat something, you touch it. Well, if you're impure and you touch something that's tahor, which is the classic case, when do you get karet? When you eat something that's pure. But as soon as I touch it and I bring it to my mouth, what's going to happen? I made it impure already. So anytime a tameh person is eating a tahor item, they're really not, because they're making it tameh on the way. So if that's the case, right, how can you possibly say the tameh shachalat tameh is not obligated? Because then every single case of a tameh person eating, where the Torah says you get karet for it, is just non-existent, because they're always going to eat something that was pure that became impure before they even ate it. So your argument makes no sense, they say to Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So the Gemara says, Shapir ka'amrle Rabbanan Rabbi Yossi Aglili. They have a pretty good claim. So what is Rabbi Yossi Aglili's response? V'amar Rava. So Rava comes and explains so that we understand this a little bit better. There's different scenarios, and it really depends what happened first, and that's going to connect with this Isur Chalal Isur. B'nitma haguf, if first the person became impure, v'achar kach nitma basal, and then the meat became impure. In this case, if the person got tameh and they didn't eat anything yet, but then later the meat became tameh and then they went to go eat it, no matter what, okay, in that case, for sure he's going to be obligated, because as soon as he became tameh, this sacrificial item was forbidden to him before. So if you take this tahor item he's about to eat and then he touches it, makes it tameh, of course he's going to be obligated. Even Rabbi Yossi Aglili thinks he's obligated. The Isur Karet kadim, because the Isur Karet came first. Okay, and Rashi says, right? He says, right. He says you can't just uproot. In other words, as soon as I become impure, all that meat, the sacrificial, becomes forbidden to me. So you can't remove that prohibition. Once I was obligated karet, if I were to eat it, it's not going to go away. Ki pligi benitma basal v'achar kach nitma haguf. The machloket is, what if the meat became impure first? Then I became impure. Now, when I become impure, if the meat was already impure, then basically it wasn't forbidden to me ever. So then, Rabbanan idle Yisur Kola. Now, the rabbis say, yes, it is a problem. Why is it a problem? Because that's, again, an Yisur Kola. What does that mean? Well, first, the meat was impure. Now, me, as a person, I can eat any sacrificial meat. I just can't eat the meat that's impure. But when I become impure, what happens? All sacrificial meat becomes forbidden to me, even things that are pure, which originally were permitted to me. Now they're forbidden to me. So because the prohibition applies there, it's going to apply across the board. And that's why whether I eat pure or impure, I'm going to be obligated karet. But, right, and therefore we're going to read it like this. Now that, on account of the fact that now all sorts of other pieces of meat are forbidden to me, the prohibition applies also to the ones that were already forbidden to me in the first place because they were impure. And obviously Rabbi Yossi Haglili is not going to hold Yisur Kolel, which is what we were looking for. We don't say that since it applies here, it'll apply there. He doesn't hold by Yisur Kolel. Now, again, that means in a regular case. But in a case where the second prohibition is more severe, it will apply. To which the Gemara asks, but wait a minute. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, he does Yisur Kolel lately b'Yisur Kal. Now, he doesn't hold Yisur Kolel is going to work when it's a light prohibition. But Yavo Isur Chamor v'Yavo v'Yachul Isur Kal. He does hold that if it's both going to apply to more things, like more meat is now going to be forbidden to that person because they became impure, and the prohibition is more severe, well, like for example, in our case, it is more severe because it's karet. Now that I'm impure, if I just ate the meat before that was impure, I would only, right, it was just a negative prohibition. But now that I'm impure, it now is karet. So it's also more severe. In which case, right, so Yavo Yisur Chamor, Yachol Yisur Kal. Umayniu Tumat Haguf, Sharei Tumat Haguf b'karet. And that's because my body's impure and that I get karet for that. So how do we explain that? Because this is exactly what we said, that this Tana that we're looking for actually thinks it's a problem in that case. So Rabbi Yossi Haglili says you're not obligated to. So they say, Dilma Tum'at Basar Chamura Delete Tara b'mikvah. They say, wait a minute. You're looking at it from a certain perspective and saying, having a person impure is more severe because they get Isur Karet, more so than just a regular person eating impure meat. However, impure meat has its own severity, more so than a person who's impure. Why? Delele tarab mikveh. You can't dunk it in a mikveh and fix it. Once it's impure meat, it has to be burned. There's nothing you can do with it. It's not fixable. Whereas a person who's impure can be fixed. So while there's one severity in this way, there's another severity in the other way, and they both cancel each other out. And in the end, it's just a regular Isur Kolel here. That again, first, the meat was forbidden to me because it was impure. Then I became impure. Now all sacrificial meat is forbidden to me. So that's an Isur Kolel, and Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by that, and that's why he doesn't obligate there. Okay, so that explains our machloket here between Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who said I'm going to be exempt, right, because I ate a davar tamei, and I'm not even obligated for it. Okay, forget about being a double, right? I'm not obligated at all, meaning I don't get karet for it. Okay, whereas the rabbis think I get karet because it's an Isur Kolel and it includes more items, and because it includes more items, the prohibition goes everywhere. But now we still have more questions of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and we're now on Amud Bet. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, lately Yisur Kolel. Wait, he doesn't know about Yisur Kolel? What about this case? Hatanya says in a Braita, it's actually a Tosefta, Shabbat v'Yom Kippurim. If you have, often it happens that Shabbat and Yom Kippur falls on Shabbat. Now, Yom Kippur is less severe. Okay, you're going to get karet if you transgress. Shabbat, you get skila, stoning. Shagad va'asa melacha. If you accidentally forgot it was Shabbat, forgot it was Yom Kippur, you did melacha. Minayin shechayav al zeh b'atzmo v'al zeh b'atzmo. How do you know you're chayav also for Shabbat and also for Yom Kippur? Okay, if it's punishment, well, you're not going to get two punishments, death penalties. But if it's by accident, unwittingly you did it, you didn't realize it was Shabbat, you didn't realize it was Yom Kippur, then you're going to have to bring a korban chatat. Now, if you're obligated for both, you're going to have to bring two sin offerings, korbanot chatat. So you're chayav al zeh b'atzmo v'al zeh b'atzmo. How do you know? Talmud Lomar, Shabbati Yom Kippurim hu. This is in Vayikra chapter 23. First it lists Shabbat, 6 days you should do malacha, then stop, rest on the 7th, etc. Then it talks about Yom Kippur, and it says Shabbat he in the Shabbat pasuk, and it says Yom Kippur he in the Yom Kippur pasuk. So you see each one you're obligated for divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. What do you see here? We're already at a problem. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says you're obligated both, but he was the guy who says when it's 2 Isurim, even if one's more, right, one adds more or something, it's not right now. Yom Kippur, by the way, adds more. It's an Isur Kolel, because you're also forbidden to not eat and all that. But he doesn't hold by that. So Rabbi Akiva Omer, Eno Chayav Ela Achat. Right, Rabbi Akiva says you're only chayav one. So now, this doesn't make any sense, according to Rabbi Yosef Glili. It sounds like he holds by Isur Kolel. To which we answer, Shalach Ravin Mishum de Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. So Ravin sent to Babylonia this following halacha in the name of Rabbi Yossi, or this explanation in the name of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Kach hatza'ah shel Mishnah. This is the way to read the Mishnah. You're right. Okay, this Tosefta is right, but the epuch. Switch who says what, and then it's perfect. Because then Rabbi Yossi Aglili is specifically the one who says you're only chayav one, which fits with his opinion. And that works. Now, apropos that explanation, Shalach Rav Yitzchak bar Yaakov bar Giyurei, another person sent from Israel, Mishum de Rabbi Yochanan, sent Rabbi Yochanan's Torah to Babylonia, and said the following. And this we're going to have to explain. We're going to have Abaye and Rav each try to explain what Rabbi Yochanan was talking about. L'divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili l'may dafchan, according to the one who's flipped what Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, and he really says you're only obligated one. But what if we have this case? This is where Rabbi Yochanan talks about a unique case where Shagag b'Shabbat ve'zi b'Yom Kippurim. So it was Shabbat Yom Kippur. You forgot it was Shabbat, but you remembered it was Yom Kippur, but you didn't care, and you did Malacha anyway. You said, I don't care that it's Yom Kippur, I'm doing my Malacha. But you forgot it was Shabbat. So now you're obligated for Yom Kippur, for Mezid, but we're talking about you have to bring a Korban Chatat for the fact that you forgot it was Shabbat and you did Malacha on Shabbat. So he says Chayav, you are. However, Hezid b'Shabbat, v'Shagag b'Yom Kippurim patur. But if you were intentional and you said, I know it's Shabbat, I don't care, I'm doing Malacha, but you forgot it was Yom Kippur and you did Malacha, then you're exempt. Okay, so in other words, again, you did one Malacha, knowing it was Shabbat, but forgetting it was Yom Kippur, you're exempt. My time. Well, what's the reason? So let's figure this out. Why did Rabbi Yochanan say that according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, we would make this distinction, depending on which one you forgot, would you bring a sin offering, would you not? So Amar Abaye, Shabbat Kviya V'Kaima. Shabbat is from the time of creation. We always know when Shabbat comes out. But we never know when Yom Kippur is going to be. It all depends on when they decide the new moon. Yom Kippurim Beidina de Kakavele. It's the court that does it. So the obligation for Shabbat kicked in before, right? It's always there. Whereas Yom Kippur, it depends on what the court decides. So that's why the Shabbat is going to kick in. The Yom Kippur is not, okay? So because it was already forbidden because of Shabbat beforehand. So the fact that now we determined it's Yom Kippur today and you made a mistake and forgot it was Yom Kippur, you're not going to bring a sin offering on that because that's Isur Halal Isur. Amalei Rav says, what kind of answer is that? Sof travayu b'hadei katu. It's true that Maaseh Bereshit happened a long time ago, and we always know when Shabbat's going to be. But when Shabbat kicks in and Yom Kippur kicks in, it all happens at the exact same moment, which means that it should be one obligation for the two together, right? You should bring one sin offering. So why? Now in this case, we're going to say if they kick in together, right? So if that's the case, it shouldn't matter whether it's Shabbat or whether it's Yom Kippur, either which way you should bring it. So why are you not bringing it if it's Yom Kippur? So therefore, Rava comes up with a different explanation. Fascinating explanation, I think. There's a lot of interesting things in this next line. Ela Amar Rava, Shma Dahava. What Rabbi Yochanan was talking about was in what we call a Shat HaShmad. It was a time when the enemies didn't want to let us keep mitzvot. We couldn't keep Yom Kippur. So what did we do? Well, Shalchu Mitam, they sent a message to the Jews from Israel. They said, listen, you Jews in Babylonia, you're struggling. This year, they're not going to let you keep Yom Kippur. Well, they said, to Yom Kippur, Hashata Shabtahu. We're going to make this year Yom Kippur on Shabbat, even though that's not the 10th of Tishrei, because they won't let you keep Yom Kippur. So just do it on a regular Shabbat, when I guess they let them keep Yom Kippur. They let them keep Shabbat, so you won't do Malacha, and you just won't eat, and hopefully they won't notice that nobody's eating. So what they did is, and Rashi says this was just to remember Yom Kippur, so that they don't forget Yom Kippur one year. But it wasn't really keeping Yom Kippur. And that's why you're not supposed to bring a sin offering, because it was a very unique case. Now, to say that Rabbi Yochanan was talking about a very unique case, right, who knows, okay? And it's even more interesting because V'chein ki ata Ravin v'chol nechute amrua kerava. Okay, and when Ravin came and all the people came from Israel, they said, just like Rava, they said, yeah, that's what Rabbi Yochanan meant. It's very interesting. Interesting to think that you could just decide, oh, we're going to do Yom Kippur any day we want. I mean, I guess so. It's not really Yom Kippur, at least the way Rashi reads it, that it was just a remembrance of Yom Kippur, but it wasn't really Yom Kippur. And that explains why he didn't have to bring a sin offering for forgetting it was Yom Kippur that day, because it wasn't really Yom Kippur. Again, to read that into Rabbi Yochanan is quite interesting because it's really not like Rabbi Yochanan says that. Okay, now we're going to get to the next part of our daf. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Va'alomi b'nei Yaakov. So remember Rabbi Yehuda's whole claim, going back now to our topic. Well, Gid and Asher are obligated for non-kosher animals because the Gid and Asher was given even before when they were eating non-kosher animals. And it also shows it's more severe because it was given to them earlier, more stringent. Tanya, so in the Tosefta it says, Amru lo Rabbi Yehuda. Here's another retort of the rabbis. V'chinemar al ken lo yochlu b'nei Yaakov. Doesn't say b'nei Yaakov. Okay, in fact, the language in the Mishnah uses b'nei Yaakov, but that's not what it said. Halolone amar ela b'nei Yisrael. Now, why is that an issue? Well, when did they become b'nei Yisrael? Well, lo nikru b'nei Yisrael ad Sinai. Much later in history, they were called. In other words, now it might have been called b'nei Yisrael a little before, but that's when they got the Torah. That's when they were really the Jewish people. Before that, right, they were individuals at that point. They weren't. Now, even though Yaakov got his name Yisrael at that point, his sons weren't called a group, the B'nai Yisrael. That happens much later. So Al Ken Lo Yochlu B'nai Yisrael is when they become B'nai Yisrael, when they get the Torah. So they say, right, Ela B'sinai Ne'emal, Ela Shenichtav B'nkomo L'dai Ezem Mitam Ne'asar Lehem, right? So again, the rabbis say it was given at Sinai, and they just mentioned it earlier, so everyone would know to what occurrence to, or what happened, transpired to cause this to happen. Mativ Rava. Rava now asks the question, what do you mean they were called B'nai Yisrael at Sinai? I'll show you where they were called B'nai Yisrael actually earlier. Vayisu B'nai Yisrael at Yaakov Avihem. This is when the brothers, right, Yosef calls them and says, go bring my father to Egypt after he reveals himself. And they go and they bring Yaakov. And it says the B'nai Yisrael brought their father. So what do you see from then? So are you saying, right, that if you say once they're called B'nai Yisrael, they should already be obligated and get on a shed at that point? So they say, La'achar ma'aseh. No, after, right, in other words, they're really only called B'nai Yisrael La'achar ma'aseh. In other words, they were only, at that point they're called B'nai Yisrael, but they weren't called B'nai Yisrael. What they mean La'achar ma'aseh is after they decide to bring bring Yaakov to Mitzrayim, that's when they're called B'nai Yisrael. After that, but not before that. Okay, meaning at the time they got the command for Gid and Asher, they weren't called B'nai Yisrael at that point, so this isn't really such a difficulty. But Amrle, Rav Acha B'rei to Rav Ashi, he shot a litzar. But then you should say fine. But at least once they're called B'nai Yisrael, well then the B'nai Yisrael who can't eat the Gid and Asher that they were commanded then, right, should kick in at that point in history when they go down to Egypt. So Amrle, right, which obviously nobody says. So Amrle, v'chi Torah pa'amim nitna, what the Torah was given at different points. Ha'ishat alav sham ma'aseh lo sham mata Torah. That time was not any particular time that it should have any significance. What, when they go down to Egypt, now we're going to say, now kicks in the Gid and Asher prohibition. What did that have to do with anything? Not connected. So this is not really a problem. So while it's true that they were called B'nai Yisrael at some point earlier, but they weren't called it at the time they got the prohibition, and what it really meant is when they get the Torah later, and they really are the Jewish people at that point, the sons of Israel, then they will be obligated. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. Last part for today, we're just going to start this. Another case, okay, we talked about the Gid and the Shef applying to non-kosher animals. We talked about Nevela applying to non-kosher animals. Now, Ever Menachai, Noheg Bebe'ema Chayav Ha'of, Bein Tzme'im, Bein Tehorim, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Elazar. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Elazar say, Ever Menachai, if you take a limb from a live animal and you eat it, whether it's from a kosher or non-kosher animal, you're obligated. Chachamim Omrim, Eino Noheg Ela B'Tehorim. The rabbis say it's only in kosher animals. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ushneim Mikra Chadarshu. Rabbi Yochanan says they both learned it from the same pasuk, which we're going to get to tomorrow, exactly how, but I'll just read it right now. Rakazak lebilti achol adam, ki adam o nefesh lo tochal nefesh im abasal. Okay, just be strong. Don't eat blood, because blood is the soul, and don't eat the soul with the meat. Okay, so don't eat blood. We're going to see how they get it from there. With that, we finish today's daf. We'll do a quick review. We had the Gid and Asher, and Rabbi Shimon's position that if you eat the Gid and Asher of a non-kosher animal, you're completely exempt, which we tried to figure out how on earth that could be, to which we in the end said the commandment of Gid and Asher is only for kosher meat. That's how we read the pasuk. Then we had this Rabbi Yehuda Amarav talking about this machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and basically saying, well, they disagree about one case, about eating a gid and a shev and a vela. They will agree if it's a more severe, like where it has also added more items, Yisro Kolel, and more severe because it's forbidden to benefit, then it is good. Even the rabbis believe the Yisro Chal Yisro, and then we tried to figure out who's the one who doesn't have that, does have that. It's Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We went in and asked a lot of questions about Rabbi Yossi Aglili's position, right, where his position was about the impure person who eats impure meat, impure sacrificial items. And then we asked, what about what he says about Shabbat and Yom Kippur? From that, we got off on a tangent about that. And then we ended with the Bnei Yaakov. And why, it's really Bnei Israel, and they weren't really Bnei Israel at the time. And that's the rabbi's retort to Rabbi Yehuda, although we said, well, they were Bnei Israel a little further on, but no, at that point, we weren't going to say, oh, now the obligation kicks in. And we finished with the Ever Menachai Machloket, which we're going to deal with more in tomorrow's daf. With that, wishing everyone a good day.